All right, so thank you everybody for being here and for the PSSN program for hosting this wonderful event, summarizing these 3 wonderful years here in the program. And I'll talk about kind of summarizing my recent work, the content of my recent work, in a kind of a new perspective. Those of you who heard my work, I'm going to take a different perspective, trying to integrate researches that I've been doing in the past 3 years over kind of 6 or 7 projects and trying to bring them together to some perspective from the humanistic side. Our earliest account of the discovery of the numerical ratios of the musical notes comes from the 2nd century Greek writer Nicomachus. He described a flash of intuition experienced by Pythagoras of Samos, who lived nearly 600 years before Nicomachus. Nicomachus writes, "By passing a blacksmith's shop, by heaven-sent chance, Pythagoras heard the hammers beating the iron upon the anvil and emitting sounds most concordantly mixed with each other. And he recognized among them the concord of the octave, the perfect fifth, and the perfect fourth, while he saw also interval of a whole tone, considered only in for itself, was dissonant." Okay. So then Nicomachus tells us how Pythagoras went home and experimentally tested the idea of hanging different weights on strings. And he realized that strings relate to each other by integer ratio proportion, like 1 to 2, and 2 to 3, and 3 to 2, gather in pleasant intervals known in consonant, where other more complex ratio, like 8 to 9, create less pleasurable sounds on dissonance. So just to illustrate that, I'm going to play you a couple of sounds. So this is the ratio of 2 to 1 between the frequency of 2 tones. This is pretty consonant, right? Okay. And this is a ratio of 3 to 2, perfect fifth. And this is the ratio of 2 to 3, the perfect fourth. And this is one of the dissonant sounds that allegedly Pythagoras heard. This is the whole tone, 9 to 8 ratio. All right. So just to say that in the aspect of like the psychological effect of those consonant dissonance also generate other more complicated psychological experiences. And I'm going to talk about briefly about 3 of them. One of them is a sense of pleasantness and sweetness that already goes a long time into the history. And the idea is that if I play you a perfect fifth or a triton, right, the first one is more pleasant. Is it for you? Okay. Another effect is possibly the idea that they mix or fuse together, okay? So the idea that somehow consonants are more one thing than another. So this is an octave, and this is a major 7th, right? So they kind of separate from one another, okay. The third one is very important to Western music, is the concept of octave equivalence. And the idea that 2 tones that relate to one another by exactly 2 to 1 ratio are somehow the same thing, And in Western music, we use the same notation, the same letter for the tones, D and D, A and A, and C and C. And you can see that goes long back to the history from this citation from Guido. And so just to play you an octave. Okay, so this is an octave. And this is, so the two tones that I played are the same note. So note name, but separate by an octave. And this is not an octave. So they're less similar to one another? Yes? Okay. So, to return to our story, Pythagoras' epiphany is associating the realization that psychological quantity, the sounds that's most concordantly mixed with each other, is associated with acoustic and physical property, the hammer's weights, and on the strings, which in turn can be described by mathematical abstraction, simple integer ratios. And they all kind of join together. The idea that mathematical rules can account for psychological and physical phenomena led Pythagoras and his followers to propose that the same mathematical integer ratio can account for a wide range of phenomena in the world, from the principle of visual aesthetics, as we heard before, to the movement of the stars. And this intuition lies at the heart of empirical Western science. So, Pythagoras' view of consonant and dissonance really gained more grounded over the next century of scientific inquiry. And I'm going to briefly describe two acoustical phenomena that are indeed linked with integer ratios. The first one is periodicity, overtones, that somehow even Pythagoras, or at least Nicomachus, know about. And the idea is when we pluck a string, then immediately when the string vibrates, it also vibrates in modes that are not just the string legs, but multiple integer ratios, multiplication of these strings. These are the modes that naturally strings move like naturally. And this emits sounds that has a frequency that has integer ratio proportion with respect to the main frequency of the string. Okay? So this is a reality of a property, of acoustic property that associates with integer ratio. The other thing that has a longer kind of, it took more time to really realize, and somehow it was formalized most prominently by Helmholtz, but is known before, is the idea of beating or overtones. And here, the idea is that if we play two tones whose base frequency do not follow integer ratio, their overtones collide. And 19th century biologists and physiologists explain this phenomena as arising from basic property of the human ear, and assert that the beating is generated when two colliding overtones are detected by the same region in the inner ear. The collision causes part of the human ear to vibrate in both frequency, and that's there generate the sensation of beating associated with this vibration. So just to give you a sound that do this collision of overtone, I play you two tones that really generate beating. Do you hear this kind of? Okay. And this is a little bit lower frequency. So it's even more apparent. And here we really hear it. Okay, and this is a sound that just a complex tone that has no beating. So just smooth. Okay? All right. So the idea that there were further discovery, one of them is the idea of neural oscillation. So it was discovered in the 20th century that there are many types of oscillatory activity in our brain. And periodic elicit electric activity in the brain generate responses and frequencies that have integer ratio proportion. This is just the basic of neuroscientific structures. So it's not a surprise that many researchers have attempted to continue the Pythagorean tradition and provide explanation that connect integer ratio to brain oscillation with the acoustical physiology of consonant and dissonance. And one example is a line of research, big line of research of Ed Large and his colleagues that try to explain consonant dissonance from neural oscillations. Okay, so let's summarize the Pythagorean kind of, what I call the Pythagorean heritage. This beautiful unity of all of those things together, acoustics and physics, mathematics, biology and physiology and music, all of them combines together so beautifully. And it's such a wonderful thing because it's also aligned with our musical intuition and our scientific intuitions. And it's just a very compelling and simple idea that consistent with everything that we know in our world. But is it really true? Okay. So, as this happens, history have a few warnings for us. The myth of Pythagoras discovering the ratios of consonants, which I opened this talk, was retold numerous times over the centuries by a lot of scholars. Surprisingly, it was only in the 16th century that Vincenzo Galilei, the father of Galileo Galilei, a music theorist and by its own, empirically found that Nicomachus' story could not be true. He discovered that if you actually put weights and strings, the frequency changes proportionally to the square of the weight. So it will not generate a resonant frequency that are integer ratio proportion. Now I'm going to show you something even worse. So my colleague Mike Cuthbert at MIT did this, just this beautiful video in YouTube. You can all see it, and you see speak by itself. So this is hammers, real hammers.
So I'll start with a small hammer hitting my anvil. And now I'll use a slightly larger hammer and do the same thing, same amount of force. And now I'm going to use this big sucker hammer to do the same thing. And there you have it.
So the simple moral of the story that we should empirically check everything, even those assumptions that seems obvious, entirely obvious. But the more interesting observation is that despite the fact that it was so easy to disprove this claim, no one until Vincenzo Galilei was bothered by the inability to reconstruct what Pythagoras would allegedly have heard. I mean, maybe they weren't making a knowing. So they actually reconstruct what was supposed to happen, right? So the important thing here is that this is a classical example of the danger of enculturation, which can blind us to the nature of the fundamental assumption undergrides our science. So the idea here, and that's I think the lesson from here, is that the people were so convinced that it must be true because it was so consistent with their musical intuition and scientific intuition, they didn't even bother to check it. Okay, so in the rest of the talk, I'm going to provide some evidence that these kind of biases are so misleading because we, experimentalists, participants, and the general public alike, are so often blind to the nature and history of our basic assumptions. And one particular unfortunate incarnation of this bias within neuroscience and psychology arises from the fact that almost all experiments are performed with participants hailing from weird, Western-educated, industrial democratic society. And however, these so-called weird participants are an extremely biased sample of the human species along a number of dimensions from social to spatial cognition. And the problem here for neuroscience is we tend to ascribe certain properties of this population that arise from cultural saturated so that these participants are saturated by culture that is saturated by Western ideas and presume that the same principle will be true universally for all humans. And this is not true and very hard for us to see it because we are so blind by our own enculturation. And all of you agreed with me that those concepts like pleasantness are applied for those consonants, right? It's so intuitively so. Is it actually something that is inside our mind so intuitively attempt to say, or is it something that comes from our experience with the music that we hear all the time? So for that, you have to do cross-cultural comparative research, and one of the ways to risk ourselves from this problem is by encouraging interaction between scientists and humanists. And for example, historians, as I show you, can help us to assess how new ideas, such as neural oscillation, are just are maybe just recapitulate older ideas rooted in Pythagorean mysticism. While ethnomusicologists and anthropologists can help us to examine the extent to which our intuitions are culturally contingent. The project that I started here in the PSSN 3 years ago aimed to try to harness humanistic perspective in order to perform a series of comparative cross-cultural experiments that empirically test, like Vincenzo proposed, the extent which basic concept in auditory and music perception depends on cultural experience. So much of the work that I'm going to present today took place working with the Chimane. These are indigenous group in the Bolivian Amazon that I've been working the past few years. The Chimane are interesting because their experience, they have relatively little experience with Western music. And I've been working there with the McDermott Lab in the first years in McDermott Lab from MIT, and as a collaborative team of research from Bolivia and Chile. And this is an example of the experiments and the kind of interactions that we have in the field. Okay, so let's start with the content. So a few years ago, McDermott tested aesthetic preference of consonant and dissonance. And with the Chimane, and he discovered that when we, okay, so this is his experiment. He played them something like a consonant, like that, and a dissonant. sorry, a dissonant like that, and a consonant like that. Okay? And to the utmost surprise of everybody, he discovered they did not prefer whatsoever consonant of dissonance. They didn't have any preference, and they didn't associate with these sounds any aesthetic preference whatsoever. Of course, these kinds of results requires a number of control experiments showing that the participant understood the task and they make effective use of the rating scale. For example, Chimane participants prefer sounds that are happy, like laughs over gasps or cry. Okay, so they understand, just like US participant, the sounds and perform judgments about them. And there's all sorts of things about translation and instructions that you need to do when you do this kind of experiment, which I don't have time to talk about, but I've talked about it before. So this is the idea of pleasantness, but what about other psychological experiment, a phenomenon like fusion that we spoke about together? So you remember that when we hear a unison, this is something this is one thing, where when we hear a perfect fifth, it seems a little bit more it's more than one sound, but if we hear tritone, it seems even less united, okay? So what we did is present these intervals to the participant and ask them, do you hear one tone or two tones? And there is a simple answer. When you presented these intervals, there are two tones. But people misleadingly say, they are misled, and they say, oh, this is one tone. And they say more so for a unison, of course, when it's correctly one tone. But they have a preference to say that a perfect fifth is more like one tone compared with tritone. That sounds to them more like two tones, more definitely like two tones. So basically, by the wrong answer to this question, whether you hear one tone or two tones, which is a very simple thing that you can see, you can measure their fusion, the tendency of this interval to fuse. And what you can see, on the left side it's a US participant, and the right side is Chimane participant. And you see that they behave very similarly with respect to the fusion of those consonant and dissonance, where we replicate the previous experiment that I mentioned before, where in terms of the aesthetic preference, Chimane were completely flat. So the Chimane participant, in terms of the aesthetic preference, did not separate between consonant and dissonance, where in terms of their fusion, this property of fusion, they did. Okay. Another thing that I mentioned earlier with respect to consonant dissonance is the idea of octave equivalence. The idea that notes with the same note name are somehow the same thing. So two tones that relates to one another by octave ratio 2:1 are somehow the same note name, and this is how in Western notation we use the same note names for those tones. Okay, so here we developed a new paradigm, and the idea was to play participant, both in New York and in Bolivia, these high tones. Okay, and the task was sing it back. So let's do it all together. I'm going to play you these tones and just sing it back, okay? Okay, so there was a distribution of tones, okay? So I'm going to show you the same experiment in Bolivia. Okay?
Recap.
So, the interesting thing is, as you heard, Chimane participants imitate pretty nicely and accurate the interval between the tones, okay? And they were comparable in terms of accuracy. This is a lower graph showing you the accuracy of the functions of the register in function of the height of the tones per note. So very, very high tones were difficult, but they were pretty good for intermediate frequencies. The crucial thing is when they created these tones, Western participants transposed the two tones by octave. So the very, very high tones was transposed to the singing tone using the same note name. So if they hear G and A very high, they produce G and A. Cimane participants completely ignore chroma. And we've replicated that, and there's many control experiments that I don't have time to describe. And in that sense, Cimane experiments behave completely different compared with Western participants. So it doesn't mean that they were completely different, because there was other aspect of the same experiment which they were similar. So there is a phenomena that in pitch perception, basically, we are not able to detect fluctuation in our auditory system that are very fast. So when the fluctuation of the sound, if the sound has a frequency of about 4 kilohertz, this is exactly the time where our auditory nerve basically cannot follow this fluctuation very fast and efficiently. And in this case, it was assumed that participants in Western culture, like our knowledge about the auditory system, would basically have trouble with high frequencies. But in the same time, a lot of Western music is using instruments that are limited to this limit of 4 kilohertz, so it's unclear whether it comes from the Western participant exposure or something that relates to this auditory system feature. What we discovered that Cimane participant and Western participant have the same trouble with very high frequencies, very similarly, and this suggests that this aspect of pitch perception is a universal, at least for the two culture that we tested. You have to do more experiments with other groups. Okay, so far we discussed abstract stimuli, but what do these principles do also relate with actual music? So this is a recent work we just sent to review recently. And what we did here, we compared consonant and dissonance in Western music, and we found that they are doing something very interesting. They are context dependent. If intervals are presented at the same time, or like harmonic, like I played you all the intervals before, or they're presented one after the other, the experiment in terms of the preference of participant, this is the lower part, is different. And this is the same thing that happens also for the corpus of large pop music, but also true for other aspects of other corpora of Western music. So the experiment, just like the corpus, dissociate between the context, if it's harmonic or melodic, and it gives us very, very different results. And these results matches, so there's a beautiful match between what we find in Western music and what we find with Western participants when we ask them about these abstract stimulus. And this is interesting because it's inconsistent with the naive version where you think of this consonant dissonance coming from mathematical ratio, because if it's just about mathematical ratio, there's not supposed to be context dependent. Okay. I just want to mention that at the same time, there are other corpus analyses from music around the world that show that actually kind of statistically, octaves and fifths are common in many types of musical tradition. And a priori, it seems difficult to reconcile with what I told you about, that are octaves in the Cimane, that are octaves and are culturally contingent. So one possibility is that the acoustic principle operates similarly in different culture, resulting in similar preference, even though the consonant and dissonance are not directly rooted in biology. So as our Cimane experiments above. So just to give you an example, when I went as a child to a Jewish synagogue, I was always fascinated by the fact that everybody sings together, but not in the same chroma or the pitch. They just kind of sing as a crowd. And listening to Cimane church services, it sounds very similar to my own ears. And I think what happens is people do sing together, but they don't necessarily sing the same chroma or pitch because these aesthetic ideals are not rooted in their auditory system. And it's not because they don't know how to sing, but it's not aesthetic value for them. But if the singing of males and females becomes an aesthetic ideal over many generations, these biases that comes, for example, from fusion can eventually lead to a progressively convergent evolution that led in many places to the emergence of octave and fifth. So the idea is that octave and fifth are not rooted in our kind of biological preferences. They are rooted in acoustical principles that we are somehow sensitive to them in different places. And if in the right aesthetic conditions and right historical development occur, it will generate the same preference in different locations. And I have a lot of evidence for that from my other work. So I just want to make an intermediate summary near the end of my talk. We started with this beautiful picture where music, psychology, and mathematical and biological principles are all united. By testing the participant with different types of exposure, we found that the picture is much more complex. It looks like that. And there are there's just results suggested there that there are each of the psychological and acoustical phenomena behave independently from one another, and they're entangled in a complex and culturally dependent web of dependencies that we can measure experimentally. However, characterizing the interdependence of the various acoustic and physiological mechanisms and compare them cross-culturally, we can lead ourselves to formulate new theories of pitch perception, one that can able to account for the modularity of these different aspects of perception. And this has the benefit of helping us lead us beyond the Western-centric bias to a richer understanding of the variety and flexibility of the human brain. So one limitation of what I described, so I'm gonna just give one kind of taste of something that I discussed already in this forum quite a few times. So one of the limitations of this work that I described is just Chimane and Western participants. And this is something that I've worked in the PSSN program towards really kind of diversifying more radically the population we're testing. I didn't do it yet with pitch perception, but it's something that I'm working now in my new group in Frankfurt. But with rhythm, we actually did it, and it also somehow relates to the story of integer ratios. So also in rhythms, we have integer ratios. In Western culture, basically only integer ratio, simple integer ratio, rhythms can be notated. All other proportion between onset of events are not cannot be notated directly. So we developed a new paradigm that I described and published about that try to use production again. So people just like singing, they tapping in this case, just finger tapping rhythms, and by exploring the responses, we can kind of see what's going on in their mind and what kind of rhythm they can produce accurately. We did a collaborative process with over 27 databases for 13 countries and over 30 collaborators around the world. 500 one-on-one sessions. No, it's not a Turk experiment, it's one-on-one field experiments in different locations in the world. And we got these results from all those places, from Botswana to South Korea, and different groups, dancers, musicians, and students from around the world. And I spoke a lot about it in last year. So I just mentioned that what we are seeing is when we take all these results together, we do see integer ratios in many, many locations around the world. So participants in many different places actually apply simple integer ratios, but they apply different simple integer ratio in different locations. And there's huge diversity between the type of integer ratios that are produced in different locations. So for example, these are maps, these are cognitive maps of different categories, rhythmic categories, and what you see is that some categories are very, very prominent, for example, for Malian villagers, and completely absent for Dong speakers in China, and there are certain categories that are universally present, but there's a lot of diversity, and again, this doesn't sit very well with some kind of mechanistic, universal mechanism of integer ratio that operates everywhere because it's not the same integer ratio in different places. And another thing that is not very common, but in some musical traditions, there are pretty elaborate and even maybe non-integer complex ratios. But this is a joint work with my collaborator, Rainer Pollack. And what we run 4 different groups of participants from 4 different locations, Mali, Germany, Bulgaria, and Turkey also, not showing this graph. And what we saw is basically Malian participant who the music contained very complex ratio, like 2 to 3, which in the rhythmic context is considered a very complex ratio, can actually produce them very accurately, where musicians, very professional musicians from Western culture, they're not able to produce those rhythms. So this is again suggested even very complicated rhythm can be produced, but with the other paradigm, we also showed that super high complex ratios like 2 to 3 to 7, very, very complex numbers, a very complex ratio that you wouldn't think from mathematical Pythagorean perspective could occur, but participants are very, very easily and naturally perform that in the experiment. So again, it's kind of reiterate the idea that integer ratios, well, there is something into it, but it's not what we thought originally. It's not a biological mechanism for that. So I just want to conclude with a few words about the importance of interdisciplinary work. My postdoc here in the PSSN was enabled by close interaction between me and my mentors and members of the community in Colombia. And I think what humanists can help scientists is to question our concepts and definition, alerting us from previous iteration of current ideas and learning from historical mistakes and critique. And scientists can help humanists by enabling them to operationalize their ideas and test them. Sometimes they can provide surprising empirical answers to questions that were subject of lengthy circular debates for centuries. Together, these two perspectives may provide an independent view of similar problems and foster new approaches to our most basic assumptions. Thank you.